Tapetum Lucidom.
Expecto Patronum. You're trying to turn me into a frog, Alan.
Tapetum Lucidom. I need to keep saying it because I need to remember how to pronounce it. You know, my Latin's not as good as it used to be compared to when I were a lad.
I don't see a wand. Do I sense a wildlife wonder coming on?
Aye, that's right. Tapetum Lucidum. That's what we're going to be talking about. It's basically about eyes. And what's a little bit more interesting is, I think, is the sort of similarity to digital cameras. So it's time to grab a beer and continue with our podcast journey across the savannas and the bushvelds of sub-Saharan Africa, where we share tips, techniques and stories from both sides of the lens, plus a lot more too. So let's see what else we have in episode 9 of the African Photography Safaris podcast.
I've got my beer boot.
I've got the beer boot. I've got the beer stein, which is... We've got a story about that. Yeah.
Indeed. In this episode, we're going to continue our wildlife photography back to basics series with a look at autofocus. We're also going to open a can of worms and talk about the ethics of image manipulation with natural history photography. We have a great question from Lorraine Stevens about making photography click. See what you did there, Lorraine? And Botswana. Botswana's incredible offer to send thousands of elephants to Germany. I should say this episode isn't going to be nearly as long as the last epic. No one was more surprised than me when I got into the edit and I thought, bloody hell, I'm going to need to lie down after this. Anyway, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, Audible, all the socials, and the website at africanphotographysafaris.com.
Yep, and we are very, very happy to share the news that we're now full for Kenya 2024. Yep. We got a last-minute booking, which has filled the trip, which is fantastic news, really, because the conservancy tourism model, such a lot of the money actually goes back into wildlife and wildlife conservation, and that feeds into the communities in the local area. And let's not forget as well, Moses, our good friend Moses, his camp it employs local Maasai people. Yeah. And I think the camp really, is still recovering from the 2020, 2022, how many twos in a sentence, the effects of the global pandemic. It really, it needs these little boosts as we go along.
Yeah. I mean, it's not only us that it's great for. There's a whole tourist infrastructure that we're able to contribute to. And with the conservancy model, which is based on landowners not farming the land, like, they might plant beans or whatever previously, but they're paid to let the wildlife and the tourism do their thing. And it's an all-round win for the wildlife, the locals, and us as visitors. Seeing as we're now full for 2024, if you'd like to come with us, you can book up for 2025's trips. They're on the website at africanphotographysafaris.com.
So, part 2 of our Back to Basics series. We are going to look at autofocus. Digital SLR and mirrorless cameras have really, really quite advanced autofocus systems now, don't they? Yeah. The technology and it's moved on loads, but the terminology can be quite overwhelming to get your head around, it's fair to say. Yeah. Manufacturers use different terms and words, but they've all got that sort of proprietary language kind of thing, but essentially it's all, they all do the same thing. It just puts a different name and a different label on it.
I think more recently we have the luxury of subject detection in modern mirrorless cameras as well, like bird or insect or animal, mammal, whatever, which is incredible. But you have to use it with care. It's not always a fail-safe solution that you might think.
Definitely, it's not perfect, because sometimes we need to know when it's not working, how to utilise other autofocus modes. I think it's a bit sort of naive just to completely rely on subject detection all of the time for everything, because you're going to end up coming a cropper.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bit like anything with a camera. You can't rely on one mode to do everything, because as soon as that stops working, you need to have a fallback onto something else. So I think we both probably agree. Firstly, let's forget manual focus. Let's just get that established. Yeah. Unless you're doing a macro study of something stationary, then manual focus is not going to serve you well at all. Maybe the caveat is, if you've got a scene that is completely fooling the camera's autofocus and you have to override it manually, like, say, a lion in long grass, and the focus keeps jumping from the lion to the grass and failing to get focus on either or whatever, if it's just not happening, sometimes you might have to use manual focus.
Or subject detection.
Yeah,
'Cause
yeah. When
in
that's
theory,
fails,
the
then you need to-
subject, if you've got it, should find the eye.
You
in
would,
theory,
you would think so, yeah. Not always.
No.
Obviously, in landscape photography, we may use manual focus, but hopefully the landscape isn't moving around. So that's
I think not.
one of the main differences between wildlife, sport, anything else that's moving, basically. Fieldcraft knowledge can help predict the general behavior of an animal. It can tell us when something's about to move, for example, and that helps us point the lens in the right place, but we're just not quick enough as humans to manually get and keep focus, especially when we're also adjusting composition and, as we discussed in our last episode, adjusting exposure too. Too many things to do at once. I do realise that all cameras used to be manual focus, and you really did have to manually focus, constantly. The first autofocus camera I ever came across was the Canon T80 in 1985 or thereabouts. Shows how old I am. My parents bought one, and I can still hear the motor focusing so slowly. Revolutionary for its time, and it was the first that Canon ever came out with an autofocus 35mm camera, but utter rubbish compared to even the simplest modern autofocus cameras these days.
I do remember, actually, Canon were quite sort of innovative with that kind of technology in cameras, because now I can't remember the exact model, but I'm sure Canon were the first to try and get the camera to focus where it thought your eye was looking in the screen. I don't think it was particularly successful, but the innovation was there, and I'm sure it's used now to much more success.
Yeah, I mean, credit to Canon for starting that off. I mean, I don't know if they were the absolute first, but it was the first I was aware of anyway. I'm also going to chuck in my 2 pence worth about autofocus and filmmaking. When I moved over to filmmaking as well as shooting stills several years ago, I was utterly shocked to find that cameras just didn't autofocus whilst taking video. This ended up being the most fundamental barrier to getting good video for me at the time. Having to manually focus everything. I had got so used to stills cameras autofocusing, and it completely stopped me in my tracks for a while. I mean, at least with stills, you can throw away the photos that weren't in focus. You just can't throw away the individual frames of a video, though. That just doesn't work. Thankfully, cameras that shoot video are excellent at autofocus now. The ones we're filming ourselves with now for the YouTube version of this podcast episode, they're doing that right now. Sony FX9 and Fujifilm X-H2S, they're set to prioritize eye tracking focus. Previously, you'd have to either fix yourself in one place with a large depth of field and hope you didn't move out of focus, or you'd have to put a camera operator on each camera to constantly adjust focus. I'm just actually thinking, I should probably check I'm actually in focus. Yeah, I am. Yeah, there we go. Nobody behind the camera, as if by magic. Historically, video cameras with much smaller sensors than the ones we use these days were used because the physics, I'm not going to go into it, but the physics meant that they had a far greater depth of field than larger sensors, a better hit rate, if you like, and they would stay in focus more easily. But the downside of that, of course, is that everything in shot was in focus and no lovely shallow depth of field and background blur and so on. A final thought on this little video autofocus cul-de-sac. I know a lot of high-end films and TVs are still shot using camera and lenses that are manual focus. That's actually completely normal. They often simply don't even have autofocus as a feature at all. But that's almost always, if you think about it, the film crew have total control of where everything is on set. The actors are skilled at hitting exact marks where they move from and to, and there's a dedicated person whose job it is to constantly pull focus. Unsurprisingly, called a focus puller. If there's any chance of things moving unpredictably, this sort of filming just doesn't work, without autofocus. Having said that, I've worked on a film set as a cinematographer, which is basically like a glorified camera operator, where you control the camera and everything else to do with it. But I still used autofocus, even on the shots where I knew we could do multiple takes if it didn't work, but it just meant we could keep the crew down and we didn't need anyone pulling focus separately. Trying to film documentaries, action, wildlife, sport, even interviews where people are moving about, even in a tiny amount, is all much, much easier with autofocus because it's dead easy for focus just to drift out if somebody moves, very slightly. So if I move back and forwards, that sort of movement, I know you can't see that on the Spotify and audio versions of this, but even a small movement like that would actually put the focus out. Anyway, that 2 pence turned into about £2, so over to you, Alan.
Yeah, it's definitely, isn't it? It's fair to say effective autofocus has absolutely revolutionised wildlife and sports photography, and I use them two together because there's very, very similar concept going on, isn't it, really, in the sort of innards of the camera. Autofocus works so much faster. It's vastly more efficient than manual focus for adapting quickly to very sudden movements, and that's what animals do, especially birds, wings and stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
They're just incomparable. So I think it's fair to say that we've chucked manual focus out of the discussion already. Within autofocus settings, there are two, possibly three, fundamental or kind of top level AF settings, and to keep it simple, we're going to refer to shutter button activated focus, I think. We'll chat on about back button and this AF on back button focus thing a little bit later. So firstly, when you're setting up your autofocus, you've got something called single shot autofocus. This basically means that the focus remains fixed as long as the shutter button's held down, held halfway down, that is, and it's very suitable to stationary subjects. Now, different manufacturers put a different label on it. It's essentially the same thing. Canon calls it one shot, Nikon call it AFS, Fujifilm call it single AF, and they also use the AFS abbreviation. I think Sony call it single shot AF, and Olympus call it SAF. So yeah, you can see the consistency going through the brands. It's just the same thing, single shot autofocus.
Yeah. But obviously, wildlife moves in most cases.
I would like to think so.
Unless it's dead.
Yeah.
So single shot focus rarely works for us. In most cases, we need to use what's called continuous autofocus. So continuous autofocus, as you might imagine, continuously autofocuses as the animal moves around. It's essential for wildlife photography because animals are often unpredictable in motion, making it challenging to keep them in sharp focus when single shot would be impossible if they were moving quickly. Imagine having to refocus every time that the animal moves around. You know, it just doesn't work.
Especially if it's running, especially coming towards you, and that sort of gap between you, your camera, and the animal is getting quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker rather than something sort of moving, you know, like parallel to you, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Very difficult to do manually. And with single shot. So continuous autofocus is called different things by various camera brands, as you can imagine. Canon call it AI Servo, Nikon AFC, Fujifilm Continuous AF and AFC, and Sony Continuous AF and Olympus CAF. To be honest, I can't remember all of those different, acronyms as they are. You know, they're just
neither can I had to research them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's continuous, basically.
Continuous focus. Yeah. So we've got single and continuous autofocus, but sometimes some cameras have this third option. It's like an AFA, and what that is automatic. So yeah, it's effectively an automatic autofocus. The camera automatically switches between single shot autofocus and a continuous autofocus based on the movement of the subject, or whether the camera's intelligence can determine the movement of the subject. Personally, I work on the basis that wildlife can move, therefore it will. It will move. And it just takes the slightest twitch of a bird's head or a perched bird to kind of move its wing or something. And if you're taking some shots, you're potentially going to misfocus if you're working with a sort of shallow depth of field and a long telephoto lens and the subject's at quite a distance perhaps.
Yeah.
So usually I advise people just stick it in continuous autofocus mode instead of this kind of hybrid automatic mode. And I just think it adds another sort of variable for your camera not to do something that you want it to do.
There's also an element of unpredictability with that, because how do you know when it's going to switch from, single shot to continuous? I've tried it before, and
how
I just
much
didn't
movement
like it.
is required.
Yeah.
I don't think my cameras have even got this automatic mode. I've never come across it, but at the end of the day, I probably wouldn't know anyway, because as soon as I buy a camera, first thing I do is put it into continuous autofocus mode, and I don't actually think this camera that I'm now using recording, I think it's probably seized up into continuous mode. It's never actually been out of that. It's not been out of continuous autofocus mode at all.
Yeah. I think it was the
manual.
The Canons used to have that
AFA
or whatever. I don't even call it that. It was AI focus or something.
No, AI is your servo. It's EFA. Well, that came from some of the newer Canon digital SLRs, I think, before they kind of went to the mirrorless sort of thing. But I don't know if the new mirrorless ones have got it or not. I don't know.
I haven't used any of the mirrorless Canons yet.
They are good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, is it me?
Yeah, drifted off script there.
We have a bit, yeah. So I'm also of the same opinion about automatic switching. My camera is always completely set to continuous autofocus.
Yeah, and I also think, just to add something onto that, it's a good part of a sort of telephoto lens technique as well. What you don't want to be doing is constantly jabbing your finger on the sort of shutter and focus button all the time for it to focus and not focus and take your shot. It just creates unnecessary movement, and the same can be said of using sort of continuous burst modes as well. But we'll probably talk about that in another episode.
Yeah. So continuous autofocus establishes when your camera autofocuses, which should be pretty much active all the time. And, when our finger is on the shutter button, halfway pressed, or when taking photos, the next thing is where we want the camera to focus. So some cameras with an entirely automatic mode will have a fully automatic autofocus. It usually focuses by looking at the closest and highest amount of contrast. Like exposure, automatic selection of where your camera is focusing is unreliable. It leaves too much chance, and that isn't an option when you're working with subjects. Although, we can direct the camera by reducing the amount of space in the scene, where we ask it to autofocus in only a part of the scene. So that might be anything from a tiny part of the middle of the scene to the whole thing, or anywhere in between. Putting aside subject detection for now, that's where the camera understands that it's looking at an animal, a human, a bird, a train, or whatever. There's all sorts of... I can't believe there's actually a train setting in some of them.
Yeah. Plane, train, and automobile.
Exactly. Yeah. Spectacles, testicles, wallet, and watch.
Okay.
Slightly obscure reference to anybody who's seen planes, trains, and automobiles. So some cameras don't have this. Sometimes it might be very effective, sometimes it might not, and we'll come back to that. Overall, we have different ways in which we can tell our camera exactly where to focus and how.
Right.
Be a break.
Cool. I have a sort of stepwise approach, which is based upon how a subject is moving. Mm-hmm. So for a perched bird or an animal that isn't moving, I would just opt for a single autofocus point, and I'd place that single autofocus point on the key area. That key area is usually going to be an eye, perhaps, or something more distant, just over the head.
Yeah.
Different cameras will have different numbers of individually selectable single autofocus points. Modern mirrorless cameras potentially, some of them do have hundreds, but you can often decide how many you want them to utilise. Older entry-level digital SLRs sometimes had maybe 6 or 7 individually selectable EF points, whereas the new Sony A9 Mark III, I think that's what you're using at the minute, that has 760 individually, which is great for preciseness. Yeah. But I would imagine you could probably say don't use 760, just make 500 or 400 available, or something
groups
like
of them, or whatever.
Yeah.
You often find that the number of points affects how quickly it can deal with them all.
Yeah, and it's just quite a lot of little scrolling around as well on the back of the camera, to be able to do that. But it does allow very precise control, but it can be a bit of a bind. So it's like everything else, man. It's just finding the balance.
Yeah. I'm going to be honest, actually, and say I've only had the A9 III out once so far. That was the Grebes that we shot.
Yeah.
So I'm yet to really play about with it. It's an autofocus system. So, for that, I can't wait to get out on safari in August.
Somebody's going to be taking the camera manual to read on the plane.
I think so. Yeah. I think so, yeah. Especially since in the last episode, we covered that bit where I was totally stumped with one of the settings, and it was a case of... human error, let's put it that way.
Never in the world.
Surely
Never.
not. Yeah, RTFM. That's
RTFM.
I can't wait to get to Kenya to really try that out. So, cards on the table. There are going to be modes in that camera that I haven't explored yet. And one of the key things I think is going to be able to switch between different modes, maybe even to have shortcut buttons or something like that, so that you have the ability to say, this isn't working, I'll switch to a different mode. And I really need to explore that with the camera. So, I've had a lot of cameras over the years, from ones that had no autofocus at all, I'm showing my age there, to the A9 III, which is incredibly sophisticated, with bazillions of options. Generally speaking, for animals, I've tended to stick to a single focus point. Historically, this is because it helps the camera's focus system to concentrate on only a small area. And if the camera doesn't have to cope with a lot of processing of the focus points, it's tended to react faster when set to a single point. Now, obviously, with more modern cameras, perhaps that's faster. Again, it depends on the camera. So some of the older cameras with only a few focus points, it was always better to try and select a single point if you could. But then that meant keeping a single focus point on an animal was actually quite tricky because, if it's moving a lot, birds in flight, with a single point of focus is really quite difficult to keep
virtually
the focus
impossible,
of
I
it.
would say, to be fair. Yeah.
So that's where you might use, say, a small group of points that follows the bird's progress across the sky. You've got a better hit rate, basically, of the points, some of the points staying on the bird. With a single point or a group of points, you can move these around manually, so it doesn't have to be at the center of the frame.
Yeah, I think as an animal begins to move, perhaps a walking elephant, a rhino, a big cat or something, they're actually often quite slow and usually very, very predictable too.
Having said that, actually, just going back to something I thought about the eye focus, you were saying about getting a single point focus on an eye. If you've got something like a zebra with what's with a long face, there's a pretty good chance that unless you've actually focused on the eye, it might think that, well, the closest point is obviously the nostrils or something like that. So that's another good point. If the camera's getting confused, again, it's about taking control of the camera. It's like, well, the camera's got it wrong, so I'm going to make sure it's on the eye.
Yeah. So with something slow, I'll probably stick with a single point because I'm not. Yeah, subject detection. We'll come back onto that.
Yeah.
This gives me the most control. Like you say, it's about me just telling exactly where the camera is to focus. But it depends on individual capability as well with panning and the ability to keep that single AF point precisely in place.
Yeah.
But as you say, birds, subjects speed up or perhaps move a little bit more erratically. It becomes increasingly difficult. And it's not possible to keep that single point in place. And this is the point where I would move up to what I refer to as zone focusing.
Yeah.
Again, it's just a terminology thing. Nikon use dynamic. I think Canon have expansion. I can't remember what Sony have. I can't remember what Olympus have, but it'll have something. It's probably called the same thing, and it'll do exactly the same thing, which is taking this sort of group of points, putting them together in a little movable matrix and dynamically sharing that AF information, which makes it easier to pan and track with the moving subjects, a grouping of active AF points as well.
I think there should be, some subset of the International Standards Organization that just tells all the camera companies, look, this is how you need to use your terminology, so it's just consistent across all brands and models.
Why not?
It's like, because we, as professionals, we can't even remember what they are half the time. So
that's more of an age thing, to be fair.
Oh, is it? Right.
Yeah.
Probably
age and alcohol related.
Age and beer, yeah. So then we have subject detection. Now, then this is where my experience takes a complete nosedive. This is going back to the Sony A9 III. This is the first camera that I've ever had with subject recognition. So I'll be testing that out to see if it's more reliable than using only one or a few focus points. I'm keen to try that out in Kenya. I'll be particularly keen to see whether the reliability improves over using a single focus point or a small group. It can be hard to keep those points, as we said before, fixed on a moving subject. I also don't know yet what factors might, affect that subject recognition. Busy backgrounds, bright backlight, erratic movement. I mean, I guess we'll come back to that once I've had a good chance to really thrash that out in Kenya.
Yeah, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. The animal and bird detection I've used from the first implementation on my camera, what on earth was that?
I'm going to see if I can do that again. Dear boot.
Oh, dear me.
Bloody hell.
So, actually, right, I'm just going to stop there and I'm going to put my nerd hat on here. Okay, get the nerd. I should have a nerd hat.
Give me a chance to clear my nose because half of the beer went up there.
I have issue with Fujifilm's implementation of this. They have two separate settings. They have one for animal and one for bird. Right. It should really be mammal and bird, as a bird is an animal.
Yes.
So, yeah,
That is very nerdy.
Fujifilm International, consider yourself told. Anyway, the subject detection that I've used has been really, really effective and very impressive to use. I remember the first time I used it when I had the pre-production version. Anyway, we'll get rid of that.
Pre-production virgin.
I'll start that bit again. Anyway. Anyway, the subject detection I've used has been very effective and impressive to use. I used a pre-production version of the XH2S.
I'm gonna have to work out how to drink out of this thing.
I think you need to change your glass
sideways. Maybe.
Yeah.
Hang on.
Has that worked? Yes, that's better. Anyway, the subject detection that I have used has been very, very effective and impressive to use. I first used it with a pre-production version of the XH2S a couple of years ago, and I was amazed. I was photographing some red squirrels in Cumbria, and I was amazed at how well it just grabbed the eye and held onto it as the little red squirrel was moving around. It was really quite good, and especially given the huge potential there is in wildlife habitats to cause lots and lots of false positives. We've got lots of shapes, lots of contrast, lots of different colours. You know, we're not in a controlled environment. We're amongst dense vegetation, trees, rocks, and all that sort of randomness can, you know, really potentially confuse subject detection. But there was an instance in Timbavati when I was photographing a white rhino, and there was quite a significant sized hole in the rhino's ear. And the subject detection was jumping between this hole in the ear and also the illuminated area of the hole behind in the sort of shadow of the ear, which was on the rhino's shoulder.
What, you mean it thought it was its eye or something?
It thought it was like a pair of eyes, I think.
Okay.
So a rhino's eye is quite sort of small compared to the rest of its head.
Yeah.
So it was just a case of, you know, dropping to a single AF point, as we've sort of mentioned before, and placing it right over the kind of nearest eye to us. You know?
Yeah, it's a really good point. You can't rely on automatic subject detection with an absolute perfect certainty to, say, mitigate against potential false positives. You know, we have to know when to take control, go back over to a single point or the AF grouping settings. The general point here is that you always need some kind of backup plan if what you're using in autofocus just isn't working.
Yeah, it's in reality, it's no different, is it? We're talking about exposure in the last podcast episode.
Yeah,
you've got exposure modes like aperture priority, shutter priority.
Yeah,
they're really good, but to use them effectively and efficiently, you need a knowledge of manual exposure, and it's all about sort of putting too much reliance on automation without having the underlying knowledge of what it's going to do.
Yeah,
and you might miss opportunities when things may not be working as well as we wish. Like I say, I've been very, very impressed with it, especially with the subjects that I say are difficult, like hippos and crocs in water, on the water surface, you know, just sort of dipping their sensors above the waterline, as an example. But sometimes although it's there and it's good, sometimes I just prefer not to use it. I often feel, it depends what kind of fettle I'm in. If I'm sort of if I feel as though my brain's working and coordinating to my hands for a change.
Depends how many whiskies we've had the night before.
Yeah, something like that. But I just sometimes think it takes away a lot of my input, and I enjoy the direct hands-on approach. I like to be constantly changing things. That said, I'm not manually focusing. I'm not that hands-on. You know.
I was thinking actually. I haven't really looked at this in mine yet, but I was thinking of actually setting the subject detection focus to maybe some kind of custom button.
Yes.
So that I know that, you know, I can switch that on and off quickly. Because if it's just not working, I can just go back to whatever it was. I don't know whether there are enough buttons yet to do that. I think there might be. But that's to be experimented with, really.
Yeah, that's what I do. I've got, I think I've got custom 1 to 7, and I have birds and animals at different frame rates throughout those custom buttons. So I just spin the dial on the top and it'll automatically drop into that sort of subject detection mode.
Actually, it's interesting. You know, I find that unfortunately, if you have to spend a bit of money to get the higher level cameras, but what they tend to do is they tend to have more buttons.
Yes.
That sounds like it's more complicated, but actually, I mean, if you look at the FX9, for example, it's got absolutely millions of buttons on it, but that's because you can just program them all and just say, well, at the touch of a button, I want to do this, and it's great, and the cheaper stills cameras don't have as many customized buttons, which is a bit of a shame, really, because this sort of thing we're talking about is about taking control when something doesn't work.
Yeah.
And, if you can press that button instantly and just switch the mode, it's great, but that is a little bit of a caveat when you're talking about which camera to buy.
It's all about saving time. If you can change your camera settings without having to move your eye away from the viewfinder, so you've got on-body controls rather than saying, right, I need to go to menu, I need to go to autofocus, I need to do this, I need to press that.
Yeah.
By then, that little whatever little tip warbler is called. It's it's now 100 yards away. So it's about being able to change things really, really quickly.
Yeah.
So we did mention back button focusing before. This is where focusing is activated using a button on the back, surprisingly enough.
Funny that.
Yeah. Instead of using the camera half squeeze traditional on the shutter button. So many cameras will have a dedicated AF on button for this. If not, you can usually reassign one of the custom buttons or another button to do that instead.
Yeah.
What it actually allows you to do is to separate the focusing from the shutter release. So as the focus isn't activated by the shutter release, you're going to focus and recompose when you're in a continuous autofocus mode, much like you would in a single shot autofocus mode. I used to use it back when digital SLR cameras were quite limited with their central groupings of AF points. Now we can pretty much focus where we want in the frame. So for me, it's a little bit of a redundant setting.
That's interesting. I was going to talk to you about this because actually I still really like it and I rely on it a lot, and that's my default mode, is like disconnecting if you're not sure what back button focus is, it's where you have to go into the menu, you disconnect. Normally when you press the shutter button down, it activates the focus system as well. Now you can tell the camera not to do that, and you can tell it to only activate focus when you press the back button. And it took a long time for me to get used to this, but I actually still use this all the time. So I wanted to ask under what conditions you find it redundant, if you see what I mean, because I still like to use that method.
Well, I don't know. I just think you can. To me, I'm not focusing and recomposing anymore because I can move the active AF point anywhere I want. Plus, if subject detection is actually finding it as well, so I think it's another way it's
that's a good point, actually.
Been made a little bit redundant.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's all just how individually how we choose to work.
Yeah,
that's all it's about. There's no, it's right, it's wrong. You should be doing this. You shouldn't be doing that. It's all options, isn't it?
That's interesting. I wonder whether that means that I'll actually change my mind once I get to subject detection and actually using that, in
Quite
earnest.
possibly, yeah.
Previously I've liked the control of saying when the continuous focus is on. And when I want to shut it off. So basically you set the camera to continuous autofocus, and then only when you want the continuous focus activated, you press that back button. So if you want to do that, my main advice would be try it at home first. It takes a while to get used to because you have to remember not only to press the shutter button but also the back button for focus. I spent an entire trip to the Farne Islands getting blurry shots of puffins when I was learning this, and
Nothing's changed, has it?
Well, nothing's changed. Yeah, just the whole trip thinking, what the hell's going on? Oh, right, okay, yeah. So something to practice before you get to the actual wildlife. One other thought that popped into my head is about pre-capture and how that might relate to this. This is when the camera's continuously watching the scene, and by the time you press the shutter button, it's already taken a number of shots in the buffer. This is something that the A9 III has, and I think one of your cameras too, Alan.
Yeah, that's right. The XH2S has had it. It's an amazing feature. And it's all just it's fantastic use of modern technology, really.
Yeah.
The mirrorless it needs to be mirrorless because obviously you can't do it with a mirror slapping around.
Yeah.
And it all sort of needs to be a very, very fast processor, so you don't get the effects of a rolling shutter.
No blackouts.
Really, fast, because it relies on the electronic shutter rather than the mechanical shutter as well.
The reason I mention that is that I'd be interested to see whether having the pre-capture on has a similar effect to sort of half pressing the shutter button down, which, previously, if you wanted to wake up the autofocus system, you would have your finger half on the button to make sure that the camera was ready for instant focus, if you like.
Yeah.
So if the camera's already taking shots, it's already engaged in that autofocus. Having said that, I'm going to have to be very, very careful with the A9 III because it can take 120 shots a second. And I noticed when I was going through the settings, you can say, right, okay, well, I want the buffer to be like, for example, on the FX9, you can have like a 4-second buffer or something, and it'll every time you press record, it will record it'll have already recorded 4 seconds beforehand. Now, imagine how there's 960 shots or something on an A9. So you can actually set it in tiny fractions of a second. So I'm going to have to be very careful about that. And that's, again, something I'm going to have to experiment with in Kenya because I haven't really had the chance to really check that out and work out what the right setting is for that.
Yeah, I think one of the times I used it in Kenya was it? It doesn't really matter. I had it on pre-shot and I was at 40 frames per second.
Right.
And I put the camera down and I didn't realise the shutter was actually firing because it's mirrorless, so it's
you can't hear
shutter.
it.
So because I was pressing on it, and basically when I went to use my camera, it just said half the battery had gone and the memory card was absolutely full. And I thought, well, how's it full? And I looked back and it was just thousands and thousands of photographs of my autofocus kneecap.
Nice.
So it definitely needs care.
And you were talking about me and autofocus buffers.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a great setting, but it needs care.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting news article from a little while ago. It's something that made me think, what the fuck, when I read it. Botswana threatens to send 20,000 elephants to Germany.
Aye, it's a bit of a bizarre story, this, really, and it's a response from the president of Botswana to the German Environment Ministry after they suggested that there should be strict limits on the importing of hunting trophies. Now, incidentally, if anybody isn't aware of what a hunting trophy is, now is a good time. So what a hunting trophy is a sort of morbid decoration of the gruesome remnants of animals which have been slaughtered in the name of sport. Lions' heads, leopard skins, and more, just basically displayed by hunters to glorify the senseless slaughter of wildlife. Just my opinion, of course, but you can probably guess where my thoughts are on trophy hunting.
Yeah, me too. Exactly the same. I just can't get my head around it. I just don't understand why you would,
especially canned trophy hunting.
Yeah,
as well. It's even worse.
So like a fenced enclosure, go and shoot a lion. Well,
that kind of get away.
Aren't you a big man? Anyway, according to President Masisi of Botswana, whose successful conservation efforts and hunting bans had previously resulted in an explosion of elephant numbers, he reversed the hunting ban in 2019 because hunting keeps the numbers in check. The increase in elephants have caused a huge increase in damage to property, crops, and injuries and death to people. I mean, I get it. In the UK, there are no apex predators here to keep the deer population in check, for example, and gamekeepers have to shoot a lot of them to control the population. It's hard to reconcile that with elephants, though, because they're listed as a vulnerable species.
They're also very emotionally intelligent as well, which, is, that when you take an elephant away from an established herd, they will mourn and they will grieve, and it will affect the dynamics of the herd. It's not just a sort of one-off animal, which is bad enough in itself.
Yeah. I think it's, just a little underlining of that. There was some research that came out recently about elephants using infrasound to actually call each other by name. I mean, that's another subject, but it just underlines how intelligent these creatures are. Anyway, it's just that, Botswana's just done so well with the conservation efforts that the elephants have got out of control there, and it can't be easy to live with an excess of elephants, even if there are declines in other countries in Africa, like across the continent. Apparently, Botswana has given thousands of elephants to Angola and Mozambique to try and manage the population. Ultimately, the general issue here is habitat degradation for elephants across the continent. But for President Masisi in Botswana himself, who's seen the population increase to 130,000, he said, "It's very easy to sit in Berlin and have an opinion about our affairs in Botswana. We're paying the price for preserving these animals for the world." He said Germans should live together with the animals in the way that you're trying to tell us to. So he threatened to send 20,000 pachyderms to them. It's unclear whether the German government has responded to this offer as yet, but they might have said something like, "Du kannst dir deine Elefanten in der Arsch stecken."
I don't know what that means, but
I do.
I think they're all going to Oktoberfest to get drunk. Hey!
Imagine 20,000 of them.
20,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Lorraine Stevens asked us what makes photography click for us. When did it all make sense? The relationship between shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and all the rest of it.
So years and years ago, when I first bought a camera, I was absolutely clueless. Still am. No, I like to think I'm not. Anyway,
well, after the comments about my puffins, you're definitely clueless.
I think, like many people who are at the early stages of their photographic journey, I was kind of fascinated a little bit by slow shutter speed photographs of moving water, particularly waterfalls, and I still am actually. I love the fairy pools up on places like the Isle of Skye. At the time, I had no idea how to do it, but I researched it and I realised that my little bridge camera that I had at the time, it just wasn't capable of doing what I wanted to do. So it became a little bit of an obsession, and I bought a very early digital SLR. I think it was the Nikon D70, and its little kit lens. And I began to sort of research aperture, shutter, ISO, the exposure modes, manual control, introducing neutral density filters. And, you know, that's how I learned. And I really do value using moving water. It's a fantastic subject for getting to grips with exposure, for either freezing the action or getting that swirling, flowing, almost misty result with a longer shutter speed while trying to hold back the sort of burning out of the whites.
Yeah.
It's often a very, very fine balance, and obviously changes all the time depending on the water flow and the ambient light. And that's basically how I learned the theory of photographic exposure and what I should quickly change to correct what is going wrong in the shot that I'm taking. So when did it all click for you?
I don't know. I'm still totally clueless.
I can confirm that. No, I can't.
Well,
I'm just joking.
Photography kind of snuck up on me over time and eventually hit me over the head. I think it was 2003 when my first daughter Emily was born, and I bought a Canon 20D because I knew that the compact cameras at the time were crap, and I wanted some decent photos of my, first child. Obviously, smartphones was something of the future, and phones didn't have good cameras at the time, so it had to be something that was half decent. I hadn't a clue how to take photos though, and I soon realised that leaving the camera in its auto mode wasn't actually taking very good photos at all. Worse was that I had no idea why some of them were okay and some of them were awful. Most of them were awful, actually. I had wasted my money. At that point, it was just a case of trying to understand all the factors that go into creating a photo and controlling the camera settings to make it do what I actually wanted. I bought lots of books. I mean, YouTube hadn't been invented then as a resource, Just going back
computers had been invented back then, hadn't they? No, YouTube.
Yeah.
Was the internet a thing?
Early days. It was a thing, but not very much. For ages, I just didn't get it, with exposure and all that sort of thing. But then it eventually fell into place. Exposure, focus, drive modes, composition. I really did read a huge number of books, though. So you remember John Shaw was a very formative influence on me. A lot of his books about things like the basics of exposure. I mean, this is going back a long time. Anyway, so it started with family photos, but when I realised what the camera could do for me, I started taking photos in the garden of flowers and bees and taking it out on walks and so on. I think this is where it really started to get a hold of me, because I started to take photos of birds and I realised the lens that I was using just wasn't long enough. So, of course, I bought a 100 to 400 millimeter lens, and suddenly it all changed. I think that was the moment it clicked. I could photograph birds and mammals. I was smitten. Sorry, Emily. Although, to be fair, I've got some great shots of her, but it was when the wildlife was accessible to me as a photographer that really suddenly changed things. I soon upgraded to a Canon 5D, and later on I chose to really challenge myself. If I was going to take my skills to the next level, I had to become professional. Well, that was the way I thought it through anyway. If people were going to be paying me for photos I was taking, they had to be good. And that was the challenge. It coincided with a career change for me anyway, and I switched systems and got a Nikon D3 and a 600mm f4. Then I called myself a wildlife photographer and started doing projects for the RSPB, and the rest is history. Expensive history. Emily's now 21, and I'm not going to tell you how much I've spent on camera gear over those years. Still cheaper than having kids, though. Oh my god. Like that.
What do you call them birds again?
The water bottle birds.
Yeah, the cuckoo or something like that. I can't remember. I never remember.
Something browed cuckoo.
So it's time for my third wildlife wonder. This is a series we started back in episode 6 when we talked about the myth of elephant graveyards, and we continued in episodes 7 and 8 with a two-parter about democratic processes that take place firstly in packs of wild dogs,
Achoo.
The sneezing democracy, and also herds of buffalo. One of them, as we said, involved sneezes, and the other one involved 80s pop icon Nina Cherry and also punkster Malcolm McLaren here. So it's a bit tenuous, but you'll have to listen to find out.
I'm waiting to see what you can drop in as a random song lyric here, so let's go.
Oh, now there's a challenge. There's a challenge. I might have to think about this. But anyway, we're going to talk about eyes, particularly something called a Tapetum lucidum.
I've still got my invisibility cloak on mine, so you can't get me.
Yes, Alan Potter. Anyway, interestingly, modern cameras are a lot like eyes. Like a lens aperture, pupils dilate in low light. They constrict in bright light, controlling the light which reaches the retina. Our retina is very much like a camera sensor too. It contains photoreceptor cells which are called rods and cones rather than called megapixels. So rods and cones in eyes are very, very similar to megapixels on a camera. The human eye is thought to have around 90 million rods. The actual number of rods and cones in animals' eyes isn't particularly well documented, but animals that we would associate with having very good eyesight, sort of lions, eagles, for example, they have significantly more rods, like hundreds of millions, thousands of millions, billions of rods. And all these cones are packed into the retina, much more than we do, and it's much like having a really, really super high gigapixel camera in comparison to what we're used to using as high megapixel cameras, even being able to capture much, much more detail and much, much more clarity from a distance, like super crop kind of thing. Light comes into our human eyes through the pupil and onto the retina, which sits at the back of the eyeball. But lots of mammals and birds have a further amazing adaptation called this Tapetum lucidum. Lions, tigers, crocodiles, wolves, foxes, elephants, owls, owls and cows.
Simon Cowell.
Owls, cows, deer, seals, dolphins, sharks. It's a really big list of animals that have this thing called a Tapetum lucidum.
I'm starting to feel a bit left out and a bit inferior as a human now.
We are very inferior. Yeah, we are.
By the way, hot off Wikipedia, Tapetum lucidum means bright tapestry coverlet. I know that doesn't add anything, but it makes me sound impressive and makes up for a little bit the fact that I'm feeling really insignificant about not having one.
I would have been kind of a little bit impressed if you hadn't said that you'd looked it up on Wikipedia, if it sounded like it had been ad-libbed, but you just said you just researched it, so I'm not impressed, so no, that's a fail vote.
My knowledge of Latin is not that good.
No.
I mean, it's not,
Mine's
it doesn't exist. Yeah.
So this Tapetum lucidum, this bright tapestry or whatever it is, it sits behind the retina, and it reflects, it bubbles like Khalil's beer. No, it doesn't. It reflects light like a mirror back into the retina. So all the cones and rods on the retina get a bit of a double opportunity at absorbing the light, and that's what helps animals see so much better in the dark.
Yeah, so it bounces back
Yeah,
off the
yeah.
back and comes
So-
back in again.
Yeah, I suppose it's not the same process, but the end result is perhaps like doubling the ISO on a camera sensor. You've suddenly made it twice as sensitive to light because it's getting double the opportunity to see the light.
Yeah.
When we're out in Africa, as you will know, we're scanning the tree line, with a torch at night just to see how many eyes are reflecting back at us, be it bush babies, hyenas, dik-diks, or whatever,
not the bush
leopards. Yeah, the bush babies, screaming bush baby. So that eye that's reflecting back, that's actually the sort of Tapetum, Lucidom creating the glowing eye reflection back at us from the field light that we're using. And it's an absolutely amazing aid to predators like lions, and they're sort of having their night vision enhanced, by this anatomy. And a Tapetum lucidum is probably one of the reasons, well, it will be one of the reasons that they do a lot of their hunting in the evening. Just like the words of the melodious, mulleted master of music, Lionel Richie, they can go all night long, all night. Life is good, wild and sweet. Let the music play on.
Okay. Melodious.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah,
challenge.
fair enough.
Challenge
You got it. Yeah. Melodious, mulleted master of music. That is an
Richie.
alliteration I was not expecting.
2-0.
Yeah. Okay. By the way, it seems that humans might have a tapetum lucidum, but they don't. Can you imagine a camera flash and take a photo of somebody and it gives red eye in a photo? But that's actually not the same thing. That's because it's actually the flash is so bright that it's actually reflecting off the retina itself, not a tapetum lucidum. Anyway, maybe that song by Art Garfunkel, "Bright Eyes Burning Like a Fire." I'm not going to sing it. Yeah, was about the problems of red eye. Maybe.
Probably not.
Probably not.
Sorry.
Is that 2-1?
No.
It's 2-1. Come
not
on,
like-
give me.
No, it's not.
Give me
It's not
what?
like-
Give me a half a point.
You can have half a point. Yeah.
I did have Malcolm McLaren last time,
You did, yeah.
so that's got to be it's like 2 to 1.5.
No, you can't have 2 to 1.5. You can have 1 to 1.5.
Hang on,
We'll not go backwards.
You're making this up.
It's time to open that can of worms now, the ethics of image manipulation and natural history photography. Now, this is just an opinion. Everybody else will have an opinion, and it doesn't mean that I'm not saying that this is gospel. I'm not saying that's 100% correct. But with digital photography and with powerful software, the possibilities of what can be changed in post-processing has expanded massively. We're going to break down what we feel are the ethical considerations of image manipulation and enhancements.
Yeah. Firstly, we need to define what we mean by enhancements and manipulation and where we feel they're different. So by enhancements, we mean improving the technical quality of a photograph. So tweaks like white balance, saturation, contrast, a bit of highlight and shadow recovery, black levels, all these sort of things. They're akin to what film photographers have done for decades in the darkroom. Many of the processes in software like Photoshop are named directly after techniques which were used in the darkroom. So dodge and burn, I think, is burn darkening. I mean, yeah.
No, actually, I don't know.
When I started, I was just like totally bamboozled by them. It's interesting that the names have carried over, and you don't really need to know them. But anyway, so it's all about enhancing the visual impact as well as addressing limitations in the cameras in being able to reflect the reality as we saw it, particularly in issues surrounding dynamic range, noise control, where the software is more effective than the camera.
I think that's the key thing for me is the dynamic range. Cameras, while they are improving the dynamic range all the time, and you've got the option of RAW, which has that little bit more latitude. It's about just being able to recover a little bit more shadow, recover a little bit more highlights, just to make it quite similar to what we actually saw.
Yeah.
If you just go off what the camera did automatically, then you're going to have sort of very, very sort of limited latitude of dynamic range.
And that's the main point. We're trying to do little tweaks. We're trying to make the image as much like what we saw in front of us as possible, not trying to misrepresent the scene. We're trying to often, in fact, compensate for the fact that the camera just can't see what we can. I think, I'm trying to remember, the human eye is supposed to be able to see the equivalent of something like 20 stops of light. So that's from totally black to totally white and all of the grades in between.
What cameras, like 12, 14 or something like that?
I think
now?
the
Depends.
best ones are sort of 16 plus.
Right.
But,
so they're getting there, but they're still not.
I think typically when you're shooting in RAW on the latest digital cameras, it's about 14 plus, I think.
Right.
Maybe a bit more.
But I bet the difference between sort of 12 and 14 is quite simple. I bet it becomes super hard to get that difference up to the same sort of dynamic range as our eyes have got. I think it'll be a massive technological jump.
You have to remember it's a logarithmic scale, so it's like each jump in one stop is 2 times the previous. Yeah. So it goes up in a curve like that.
Definitely.
Anyway. So we're trying to compensate for the fact that cameras just don't see as well as we do, and that's fine. So often it means compressing things or sort of expanding highlights, shadows, to try to represent what we actually saw. Yeah.
So that's what we mean by enhancements, but let's jump to the sort of more controversial manipulation. And by this is what I kind of mean is that we're creating something that never happened or that it doesn't exist. You're perhaps adding or removing animals or trees or other elements of the habitat. Consider an image of a pair of lions on the savannah. Absolutely normal occurrence.
Just lying about.
Yeah, lying about. Boom. Something that we've seen and photographed many, many times. However, if one or even both of those lions were added from different photographs, then you're no longer documenting reality. No matter how plausible, it's still a sort of fictional narrative.
It might look realistic.
It might look realistic, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Now, I believe that ethics in natural history and wildlife photography should extend beyond the actions when you're actually taking the photograph. So you've got to be ethical. You've got to, be careful that you don't cause disturbance. But I think those ethics go a one step further. And I also believe that there is a sort of implicit trust that what you are showing is a true representation of a moment in time. Now, there are grey areas. I get that. What about perhaps, like removing a bit of litter or something from a scene?
Yeah. Or
or perhaps you've got somebody sitting in the background with a bright red fleece on or something like that. You might want to just kind of get rid of that. So opinions will vary widely among photographers. I personally wouldn't be averse to cloning out some litter. Some people say, well, that's manipulation. Yeah, it is. But I'm not misrepresenting the subject and I'm not misrepresenting a natural habitat.
Shouldn't have been there.
Shouldn't have been there. Yeah. I mean, I'd actually rather remove it and dispose of it beforehand, but, you can't really do that. But what about that blade of grass that's running up through our lion's face? If we clone that bit of grass out, what we actually do is we potentially change that lion's identification because that facial markings, the whisker pattern, scars and things, that's how lion ID kits are used.
We've actually been involved in that.
We've done a lot of work for that with Niels, who we'll might introduce in a future episode.
I think so.
But that photograph then becomes absolutely useless as conservation evidence. And the same goes for any scars or wounds that some people may find distracting. I put a photograph of a lion on some social media a couple of weeks ago and somebody said, you should have cloned that big scar out. And I thought, well, no, because that's documenting reality. That's part of that lion. It's what makes it identifiable and it's reality. Absolutely. Adding animals like lions and elephants, these are all individuals that can be identified through ID kits. And it creates an incorrect and false record. So if in 10 years' time somebody said, well, what was that? Which 2 lions were these? You're effectively adding a lion from Timbavati into the Masai Mara or something like that. And it's not. I mean, I'm being a little bit sort of extreme there, but it's an incorrect and false record, I believe, anyway.
Yeah.
I'm an advocate of photographing wildlife with context. I.e. showing the habitat, showing what's going on around it. And part of that is about telling a natural history story. If I start moving or adding or removing trees to suit aesthetics, then it goes directly against the concept of what I'm actually trying to achieve by photographing contextually and including that habitat. And, to be honest, I'll hold my hands up and just say, well, I'm not really knowledgeable enough of the software processes involved, the cloning, the selections and all that kind of thing. I'll be one of these people that end up creating a photograph with about 2 or 3 different depths of field and shadows in opposite directions and different white balance and the perspectives, like a goldfish looking at its reflection at the back of a ladle or something like that. That's me. But I mean, I could of course learn. I could learn to do that, but to be honest, I'm not that interested in doing that. I don't really. It doesn't do anything for me.
There's not that many goldfish on the savannas of Masai Mara.
No. Looking in the back of ladles,
especially the ladles. Yeah, it's like, oh, there's a shot I've heard of, like goldfish in a ladle. So I'm broadly with you about the wildlife photography. Although maybe I'll go a little bit further. In the name of art, shall we say? So
Art Gothenburg.
We've already been there. So for dramatic effect, perhaps. So an example would be my buffalo image from the last episode, in episode 8, where I selectively darkened a lot of the image to make it really dramatic. This to me is a bit like post-processing a dramatic portrait of a person, which obviously, people think, well, that's fine. But to be clear, I'd never put this in for a competition, for example. It would be classed as over-manipulated. I reckon, and this is just my own take on this, it's the difference between documentary photography and art photography. Art is often a bit more dramatic. In the buffalo image, for example, I haven't added anything, but arguably I've taken something away by darkening some of the areas. Probably true. But it was all still there in front of me. I didn't add a camel hump or a traffic cone to it, although having had that thought, traffic cone sounds appealing, and I'm going to do that now.
Yeah, I also do that from time to time, yeah. I suppose, fair enough, it is a form of manipulation rather than enhancement, or is it sitting somewhere between the two? I don't know. It's a massive, massive discussion, and we did say this was a bit of a can of worms.
Yeah.
But again, I think as an enhancement, it's working with what's already there in the photograph rather than adding something into the photograph. And I think it's more of an enhancement than a manipulation, perhaps. It's debatable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's down to interpretation.
It's not a false sky or anything.
Intention.
Yeah.
I have to say, I've never replaced a sky in my life. I don't really see the point.
I'm just not good enough with software to do it. I'm not.
I could do it, but I don't see the point.
No.
Why?
I'd rather do it.
It's like it wasn't there.
Well, I look at photographs, and I look at photographs for what they are. Mm-hmm. They are a memory of something as well. Yeah, it's a professional thing that I've produced to try and gain income. But every time I see a photograph of a lion or an elephant, in most times I can actually remember taking that photograph, and that means quite a lot.
It does, yeah.
Now, if I could do that with something that didn't happen, then it's not real. It's not a memory. There's no emotional attachment to it.
And I think that goes back to why you're creating it. So, for example, if you're creating an advert for something, that might totally change your perspective on things. Like, well, anything goes, really. Fill your boots. Yeah. It's down to your intention, and this sort of thing isn't trying to faithfully represent the scene as it originally was. You can tell Photoshop to use its AI features to add all sorts of crap around your image, and it often looks realistic. It depends what you're actually aiming for. But if you wanted to
People
try
with
and
9 fingers,
9 fingers, like a leg coming out of the stomach or something,
a leg shaped like your beer boot glass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is an AI aberration of a beer glass. Well, drink with it.
Anybody's got coughs like that and feet size that big.
So in summary, it depends on your intention. If it's important to be honest about how you're portraying the scene, stick to minimal processing like we were talking about before. If, however, you want to create something else entirely, feel free to add a traffic cone or a goldfish. Well, thank you for joining us on episode 9 of the African Photography Safaris podcast. Episode 10, well, that'll be along eventually, but we're going to Africa in the meantime.
I have a good idea for episode 10.
What, drink beer whilst doing a podcast?
Perhaps, but, well, actually all good ideas come from beer. That's a fact. we shall discuss this in the pub later,
Yeah,
I think.
definitely.
But this time next week, I will be heading to South Africa. I will be pretty much on the plane now. And I'll also be going to Botswana, where I'll be for 3 to 4 weeks before I meet up with you in Nairobi, and also our fantastic guests that we're going to be showing around the Mara. So also, I may have a couple of rather special pieces of equipment with me, but more on that another time, just in case it doesn't actually happen.
Well, I know what they are, and I'm quite excited to see what those are.
But it might not. It's not.
Well,
I haven't got them yet.
Yeah, true.
And I might not be able to fit them in the bag.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the easiest thing to walk through the airport security holding.
A note to the editor, by the way, i.e. me. You might be on a plane to South Africa, but I'll be editing this.
Yeah. Well,
Division of labour.
It is.
You can keep up to date by connecting with us on social media and so on.
We should list them in the YouTube notes.
I'll just say that a little bit again.
So that was part of the script. I just decided.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
So you can
We'll put them in. I'll do it again just in case. You can keep up to date with connecting with us on.
Actually, I think we should.
Oh God! It's like the interrupting cow joke. It's like.
No, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Right, I'm not doing it again.
Go on, do it again. Go on.
You can keep up to date by connecting with us on social media, on our African Photography Safaris accounts, and also on our individual Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok accounts. As we mentioned earlier, we're fully booked on this year's safari to Kenya in 2024, but if you want to come in 2025, we're already and have been taking bookings for 2025. So if you're interested in coming with us next year, get yourself over to africanphotographysafaris.com. .com. I don't know why I'm saying it like that. .com.
.com.
Yeah, .com. The best safari podcast. Don't forget, you can send us questions, comments, and topic ideas for future episodes. DM us on the socials or info@africanphotographysafaris.com for email. We love answering your questions. We really do. Ta-ta.
Cheers.
Cheers.